Start. We're underway. I will introduce myself. I am Jim Gustafson, professor of psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin Medical School, giving my 16th of 36 lectures every Friday. Today's lecture is called Psychiatry as Comedy, Appearance Seeking to Triumph Over Reality. The word comedy has many meanings. The first meaning I want to take is rigidity. This meaning is, for our patients, it means characterological rigidity, which will not get them to the romance that they propose for themselves. It cannot possibly work. It is laughable. It is absurd. I will give you an example from Bergson's book on laughter from 1900, and he always takes examples from the great comic dramatist Moliere. So here's our first case, and this person could be our patient. For instance, consider this comic note: appearance seeking to triumph over reality. In other words, he will duplicate what is ridiculous professionally with something that is ridiculous physically. When Brise-Soisson, the judge, comes stammering to the stage, is he not actually preparing us by this very stammering to understand the phenomenon of intellectual ossification? If you don't know what that word means, it means turning into stone. We're about to witness. Thus, and this is what the whole lecture is about, the detail gives away the appearance that seeks to triumph over reality. And in everything we take up now, the patient will signal, the person will signal at the very outset by a gesture what the whole thing's about. And that will lead into the whole mythology of American literature, and that will lead into the whole biology, which we'll get to shortly. Okay, now let's take a typical example of our own. A resident is conducting an intake evaluation. I'm there for what's called a clinical skills exam, and I watch the resident. The patient is a typical American male in his 40s who is complaining of chronic depression for 20 years. He has been drinking heavily in the evenings for about 20 years, but he stopped 2 months ago. Now he feels worse, of course. A series of antidepressants have had no effect. The resident does a perfect job of what she's supposed to do. She rules out all the things which I won't list for you, since you know them all by heart. Having performed this perfect evaluation, she makes a diagnosis of depression not otherwise specified and alcohol dependence. Her recommendation is another pharmacological agent, buspirone, with mild anti-anxiety and antidepressant properties. What is the comedy that has been missed in this perfect examination? First of all, the patient's chief complaint has been ignored. He says he is depressed because he is stuck in a marriage with a woman he has never loved. He married her not to be alone. Then he gave in to her wanting children, of course. And as two of them, he did not want. Then he hurt his back on the job, and he felt more depressed. Why did he do all these things? The hint let drop, and here's what I mean about a detail which gives away the whole thing from the very first moment, is that his parents divorced when he was 7, and his father, an alcoholic, left and died a few years later. He was left to grow up with his mother. He looked depressed to me, more so talking about this, and quite angry. His eyes glinted. What is he doing to lock up this history in his body? I saw it the moment he walked in. He grimly nodded to me and went like this, right? And sat down, folded his arms over his chest. He went along with the resident's procedure as he went along with giving in to his wife. And probably as he did with his mother, acquiescing while nursing a huge bitterness. So, it is a bitter comedy, but it is absurd. So, the examination is a comedy also. For it is totally caught up in describing the pathology. It is absurd to propose to help someone get unstuck, this is the patient's complaint that he's stuck, without a history of how he got himself stuck. The history is all there. This would take a capacity to get inside his collapsed system, back to when and where his romance still had hope in it. And his lifeline, therefore, was not yet cut. You could do what Winnicott did, what he always did with these children. Once he got below the surface that's locked into place, right? Once he got this, you're not going anywhere. The thing is collapsed and the lights go out. But there's always a terrible grief of being betrayed, and there's also always a terrible rage in these cases. It might be too late for this man, but this is the only chance to reach him in his pointless acquiescence, which is that he gave up a long time ago. And he keeps giving up at every turn in the road, right? You see how the person gets locked in by the same thing? Probably, why did he do this? Well, was there some point to his pointless acquiescence? I think so. There always is a logic, you know. Probably he did this not to be like his father and leave. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's his point of pride, but it also finishes him off. And stayed with the family. All right. Now we go to the opposite. In American mythology, Mike and I were just discussing American mythology. You didn't even know there was such a thing, but you're about to get a complete education in American literature in 5 minutes. How's that? I happen to be an English major too, like Paul. And it's not about acquiescence as an appearance seeking to triumph over reality, but we're talking about the opposite, which is full-blown romantic will, which none of us here in the room have. An appearance seeking to triumph over reality by romantic will. America is a very romantic country, maybe the most of all. Now, there was a story I read in English class when I was 15 years old called Windwagon Smith. Do you know that one, Paul? You can look it up, you can Google it. I laughed out loud the whole hour while no one else let out a sound. Wilbur Schramm had composed it in 1941, the year I was born, for Atlantic Monthly. I will give you a taste of its quality so you can contemplate the opposite rigidity in American character, the manic side of, if you will, of American character, which counters depression by running ever faster, right? But I didn't then see that I was at the center, in loving this story, I didn't see I was at the center of American mythology. That took me another 55 years to see that. Nor did I see that this is the center of what E.O. Wilson, my first biology teacher at Harvard, called the breakout of Homo sapiens from Central Africa between 135,000 years ago and 90,000 years ago. Do you know that Homo sapiens almost disappeared? There were a few thousand left because of a long drought. And then suddenly the drought ended and this population began its breakout and basically colonized the whole world, the whole planet. Wilson calls this the serial founder effect because each one of these breakouts was led by a founder, and then that would lead to another founder, and that's how it went out in all directions. Astounding. So you see, the American mythology is part of the same. The American, right? Same thing happened in America. It's part of a huge piece of our evolution that we have to understand. Now I will give you the blueprint of this serial founder effect. You can look at the whiteboard there. And just look at ignore the wind wagons on top. We'll come back to this drawing later. But basically, the blue lines are what I'm talking about, the blueprint. So number one, the short line is always the acquiescence. People go a certain distance and then they give up. And then there's always founders who rush on to the next level, right? And you'll see, so our first case is like one. He goes a short distance and gives up. And now we'll give you these sort of founder guys who, you know, are full of the juice and full of danger. So now we can come back from the board momentarily, and then you'll see what those wind wagons are. Now you're about to get the punch of this whole lecture. All right. So let's get a feel. So we're in a position now to understand American mythology and its comedy as fundamental to the practice of psychiatry in this story. Of course, for every founder who founded another great breakout, many foundered on foolishness. Can you imagine in Central Africa? A lot of these breakouts worked, but a lot of them were led by people who were slightly, you know, cracked, so to speak. And that's true of American, you know, that's the whole American history. And there have been a lot of founders who are cracked, and there still are. None of them in this department, I assure you. So anyway, but in other words, there were many foolish foundings of appearance seeking to triumph over reality, like Bridvoison, the great judge, right, who can only stammer. So, but most people acquiesce, and then their lights go out, and then some are full of false light, and a few actually are you should follow, but this is America, you see. All right, so now let's get the story. The story begins with this grand pair of sentences. Windwagon Smith had a face like any other man and 2 legs to walk on. But the morning he rode into Westport, the quietest mule in town jumped 16 feet. And some men would have flown like bald eagles. See, now already in 2 sentences, you have the gesture, right? It's jumping and flying, right? I call it unbridled letting loose, which is a very favorite American activity. Now, this campus every weekend, that's the whole, it's unbridled letting loose. That's the other side of America. I went to MIT, and during the week they acquiesced, and then they unbridled on the weekend, and then, you know. So this is the whole mythology. Well, Smith comes into town on a Conestoga wagon, propelled simply and only by a sail, which of course alarms everyone. They've never seen such a thing. After a great deal of consternation, he proposes to the local businessmen and the star of the West Saloon in Westport that they will become millionaires in no time by funding a fleet of clipper ships 10 times the size of the Conestoga wagon. Finally, after he leaves them to ponder his proposal and doubt for a few days and let him, you know, doubt it, they fall for the great proposal to take over the entire trade of the prairie with a fleet of wind wagon clipper ships and fund the first ship 10 times bigger. And they start building this gigantic ship with a big sail, right? And then they're ready for the maiden voyage, and the Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of War come on board, and there's one stowaway, a beautiful Rosalie, daughter of one of the businessmen, hides somewhere in the ship, which is part of the story. And then the ship indeed flies like the wind on its maiden voyage and terrifies the small businessmen out of their minds. And the investors, you see, are all on board the ship. And one of them, in panic, grabs the brake and manages to apply it to one of the wheels, and now I'll quote you the text, and this will be the end of the lecture. Later, they knew what happened. A brake on one wheel will stop a wagon going slow, but not a prairie clipper at high speed. The brake held just long enough to throw the clipper into a sharp turn and lock the steering gear. Far back, the crowd watched admiringly as the wagon bore down stern first upon them, cutting a wide arc over the waves of prairie grass. Not until it was 200 yards away did they stop cheering. When it was 100 yards away, they scattered like a buffalo stampede. The prairie streamed pintos. Now, there were 3 little gullies in the path of this circle. Every 20 seconds, the wagon hit a gully and the passengers bounced around like popcorn. About the 10th gully, the Secretary of War bounced out. He lit in a ball and rolled like a tumbleweed. Then he got up and ran like a jackrabbit away from the path of the wagon. "Stop the ship," shouted Jake. "Stop the ship at once. We've lost his honor." "You stop it," Punch suggested. "Excuse me," said the Secretary in the Navy, and jumped. He yelled and sprang up and began to pick things out of his pants. "Dwarf cactus," Punch suggested. "Gentlemen," said the doctor. There's always a doctor on board, thank God. A man of reason. "I know the consequences of broken bones. I do not advise jumping." 2 more passengers jumped, and then another, and finally the doctor himself. Anyway, soon all but 2 had jumped ship, and the story concludes as follows. We're in the last. So you see why you can look at it, the diagram on the board. You see, in other words, here's our founder, in his great ship, and he's cut loose. And now here's the end of the story. You can come back to me, Ed, and I'll end the lecture. The wind wagon changed its circles into ovals, its ovals into a pattern that couldn't be made out because it was so far away. The last time anybody saw it, it was scudding backwards to the west. Rosalie and Windwagon were sitting close. Whenever they hit a gully, they held on to each other. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Of course you have. Our practice is full of founders, like this one. And as well, for the small businessmen taken for a ride, not to mention their wives. This is appearance seeking to triumph over reality. Our only case. Thank you.